Today we had a pleasure to have at the Institute of International Relations a distinguished guest from Central European University, Professor Carsten Schneider, who is a specialist in qualitative comparative analysis. So, Professor Schneider, my first question, how would you categorize QCA in the broader categories of quantitative, qualitative research, and in some broader methodological perspectives?
Yeah. Well, I think my first reaction to this would be that probably the distinction, which has much been discussed and exhaustively and exaggerately between qualitative and quantitative research, can and probably should be replaced by one that is rather set theoretic and not set theoretic. So positioning QCA, the first point would probably be it's just one of the techniques within the broader field of what has now been labeled set theoretic research. And with this distinction, maybe it will not be much more fruitful than that between qualitative and quantitative, but I think it has been exhausted as qualitative, and it has many flaws that have been discussed. And so I wonder whether we not learn more about how we do social research by distinguishing between set theoretic and not set theoretic. It seems to have many virtues, and it cuts across this qualitative and quantitative divide, at least to some extent. So you can run a QCA with thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of cases, and you would still get a different answer than using the same data being analyzed with statistical techniques. So, but you can also do a QCA with very few cases, or fewer cases, not too few. So it's not a matter of how many cases you have. The difference is really whether or not you look for sets and their relations, or whether you don't. So in a sense, I'm a big supporter of that proposition, which is forcefully put forward not only by the person who, so to speak, invented QCA, by Charles Regan, who, as a matter of fact, in his first book, the word set doesn't, if I'm not mistaken, not really appear. So there the point was more Boolean algebra, but it clearly moved into the direction of set and their relations. So not only in Charles Regan's writing is QCA be reinterpreted or interpreted more clearly as a set theoretic method, but other scholars broaden this claim and say, the notion of sets permeates a lot of qualitative research in general. Qualitative research, so I used now this category still. So these scholars like Gary Gertz and James Mahoney in a series of articles, but now condensed into a book called Two Cultures, actually start with the notion that there is qualitative and quantitative research, but they redefine qualitative research as set theoretic research and spell out in chapter after chapter how this makes a difference in how you form concepts, what type of causes you're looking for, necessary, sufficient causes on the one hand versus difference makers or correlative causes on the other, what types of concepts and how you construct your population. And I find there is a lot of raw material that in the upcoming years need to be discussed in detail. And this discussion has started, and I think what we can see is that there are, much like QCA, also this proposition of set theory being at the bottom of much of what we do is, so to speak, criticized for good and bad reasons, both from quantitative or statistical researchers and from qualitative researchers who do, in their understanding, real qualitative work. So scholars who do thick descriptions, who do a lot of field work and brightly claim that their contribution to knowledge is really discovering facts find probably little help in the statement that what they do is set theoretic research. You know, and I think there is a point to it, while at the same time, quantitative scholars from the other side, you know, try to claim that the notion of sets is meaningless. There's no difference to variables. Finding set relations is not what we are doing, or alternatively, we can do this with existing tools. So some of these claims seem to be plausible, others seem to be less so. So basically, both QCA in the past 20 years has been fallen between two chairs, the qualitative and the qualitative. And is now also with this claim that set theoretic methods are somehow a coherent family of techniques that have a place in social science research, is both also attacked from existing fields, you know, and that is the battlefield, so to speak, right now, which, if handled in a constructive manner, can be productive. But if it's more about resources, so how many faculty members do I get and how many students can I place, how many journal articles here, then it becomes probably problematic. And there we will see a big difference, I guess, between the United States, with a very competitive labor market in academia, and much more pronounced selection mechanism into schools and traditions and and there are also more fashions that we see. That's not so much true in Europe for good and bad reasons. So I predict that probably more development in terms of set theoretic methods, not more, but manpower, more manpower will come from Europe. But the decisive battle needs to be fought probably, I would say, in the US, because most journals published, high-rank journals and so on. So it will not be a success, so to speak. It will not be established as a method, as a family of techniques, if it only succeeds outside the United States.
The QCA gains strength here in Europe, and then it launches its attack on US territory, on US journals, and at ISA conferences.
Attack would be too much. I would not like to see it as a zero-sum game. I truly believe, and even if people never use QCA, and actually find good reasons for not using it, the reasons they need to find for not using it will hopefully also inform what they think is a better method. So if this debate at the end contributes to a increased awareness of scholars of their methodological assumptions that are intrinsic to the methods they use, I would be totally fine. So in this sense, I think we can even already see some positive effect. So certain topics that, according to my reading, haven't been so much on the agenda 15 years ago are now maybe made it into the mainstream of qualitative research. And the same, and say, qualitative research, where now more emphasis maybe is given on trying to formalize, condense statements that are made. So I very much along these lines like what I was told by both Gary Gertz and James Mahoney, who have an article that they jointly wrote on trying to graphically represent what Theda Skoshball's claim in her famous book is. And it is a pretty complex claim, but it fits on a one page of a paper, and using just formal logic. So what implies what, and is functional equivalent of what, they were able to demonstrate or synthesize her claim, and they apparently showed it to Theda Skosh. She said, yes, that's a fair description of my 1,000 pages. You managed to get it on one page, and I think that's good. So if there was also a sense of among qualitative scholars that it's good to describe and to be true to detail, there is a mathematical tool that is very much in line with how we reason when we use words, namely set theory. So why not use it?
Yeah. You know, the big advantage of QCA is the level of formalization, and I think that this is something which can impress the American audience, because the American audience is used to formalized methods, and I think it's much easier for a QCA to gain ground in the US than the truly interpretivist methods, which are sometimes too not that normalized. I'm speaking about.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting observation. But if my experience with United States that I had here and there, there are so to speak enclaves, certain departments that. Or schools that made it into certain institutions, but not in others. So it's more segmented, and some segments are interpretivists, and great people, interpretive scholars, are in the United States. And now with this formalization, and thus this making QCA more appealing, I think it can also be put upside down. So because it's so formalized, people who are good in more formalized methods, and here let's say statistical methodology, apply the standards that hold for their research to QCA and don't see the nuances and differences. Some of the standards need to be applied to QCA, such as robustness. So that this is a fair claim that people say more attention must be paid to robustness of QCA findings, and that's in the making, and it will be solved. But if this is, so to speak, used as a scapegoat argument to say just because you haven't already talked about robustness, you can never talk about it, or you will never fix this, and therefore it's by virtue of this a wrong method, I think pushes it a little bit far, but some seem to make that claim, and what then people who think that QCA is potentially a viable method need to develop standards for robustness. But there are other standards that need to be developed. If you think that how long did it take in regression to integrate time series, I mean that was probably after a century. So it's no surprise that some things might be imperfect, and we need to, I think, distinguish between problems in practice, so as it is practiced now, QCA, and what we know about it now, from fundamental impossibilities, flaws, and if there are, James Mahoney again has categorized, informed critical, so you can be informed and not informed, critical, not critical, and then the informed critical and the uninformed criticals, and uninformed supporters, and so there are different ways of how you can think about QCA, and I think the critical and informed people are the ones who can push it forward and should push it forward. So that's for sure. But again, I think the broader and probably even more broadly appealing point is really this using sets and set relations and notions of sets to rethink how we research social phenomena and how we express what we found about social phenomena. So,
just following what you have just said, the importance of QCA is the contribution into the question: how do we interpret the social phenomena? And so it also tackles the question or the problem: how do we pose the questions? So I would be interested to hear what are the differences in how we pose the questions in QCA, because in QCA we often deal with asymmetrical causality, so we have to be careful how we pose the questions. But at the same time, we have to be careful how do we interpret the results, because it's very tempting to interpret the results of QCA in a mainstream way, in a statistical way. So I think that this is one of the pitfalls of doing QCA. Just that you really need to stick to a particular vision of causality, particular vision of social science.
Yes, I think you're right that if I find that a specific combination of conditions is sufficient for the outcome, and there's another combination of conditions that is also sufficient for the outcome, it would do violence to the logic of QCA to then start only talking about a single Eines condition in this conjunction, as if this was the cause. It's just an Eines cause, which in itself isn't enough. So you have to somehow abstract. But I think that is something that I always feel, and this could be done more in my own research, that you find conjunctions, give this conjunction a name. So stop talking about the individual, but what is this conjunction standing for? So move up on the ladder of generality, to use Sartori's terms, and tell me what is this conjunction? What is the concept that expresses itself in this conjunction? And you can go even further and say, well, if there's two or more of these conjunctions, are these conjunctions also, again, somehow different empirical expressions of a higher order concept? So oftentimes we learn by interpreting our findings in a truly conjunctural way. I think we can learn more than if we stay at this low level of generality and just talk about, oh, I found these three conditions combined are sufficient, so tell me what this means. But there is another aspect, I think, of what kind of questions we ask. So some methodologists distinguish between researchers that are Y-oriented, that are interested in explaining the outcome, and others are X-oriented, they are interested to show that something has an effect. You know, that is mostly, but not perfectly correlated with qualitative being Y-oriented, quantitative being X-oriented. Now, where does QCA stand? I think it is more Y-oriented. So you somehow have a phenomenon that you find interesting to understand, and now you try everything it takes to figure out what actually produces this outcome. And if it takes three conjunctions to produce this outcome, you know, and they are not mutually exclusive but still separate, so it be. And you don't have really hypotheses on single conditions, you know, like you would have in X-oriented research. They would say everything else constant. Does this also have an effect? You know, medical research. Everything has been constant. Does this pill also contribute to the curing? That's absolutely important and legitimate, but it's nothing you can research with QCA. So X-oriented research is not the domain necessarily of QCA.
I was also curious to hear this distinction between probabilistic notion of causality, the additive notion of causality on one side, and the conjectural notion of causality, which is so typical for the set theoretical research.
Maybe that's actually a follow-up to what we have said before. Well, the problem with QCA, you might say, is a problem. You almost by default get, you know, very complex expressions. So a combination of three conditions or another combination of other three conditions is sufficient of the outcome. It's oftentimes challenging to interpret this theoretically, but you have to. But if you can't make theoretical sense out of this, then I think that's a non-finding, so to speak. So it seems to be easier to use the formula everything else constant. Does this also contribute? And you say, well, it does or it doesn't, and then you also have to have some theoretical story. But it seems to be easier to tell us a theoretical story. At least that's what we commonly accept, I think, in journal articles or so. The Gaussian model, and you find this significant, and you say, well, look, this was my hypothesis, and anyway, or this is the mechanism behind it. It seems to be easier to theorize. You know, we can have a long talk whether it's really so much easier to theorize about, you know, average effects and so on. But I agree that if you have conjunctions, it's difficult to tell us to tell a story that is theoretically or conceptually meaningful. But I think you mentioned something else, which is not really about conjunctural or not, but probabilistic and deterministic. Nothing speaks against running a QCA using criteria of statistical significance. So whether a condition is really consistent can be tested, you know, with the known tools of significance tests. But there is another dimension about deterministic, probabilistic, which you know brings us into the fields of philosophy. At which level do we think the world is probabilistic, ontologically, epistemologically, and so on? And I just want to say that it is too simple to say that because QCA is based on formal logic, it is deterministic, and that necessarily is wrong. We can integrate deviations from perfect subset relations with parameters of fit. We can even use statistical measures for this. But still there is a dimension of probabilism and determinism that needs to be discussed, but we need to include other methods there too. So how does, for instance, Theda Skocpol handle determinism or probabilism? How does she express probabilism? how do actually people who use probabilistic methods think about the world? Do they really think it's probabilistically driven, or is it not fundamentally deterministic, but we just haven't found out the right model? So there's interesting debates, but it's nothing about necessarily only QCA being good or bad. So it's somehow different.
Yeah, it's a more general discussion.
Yes, but it is oftentimes used or has been used as a kind of a dismissive argument. But I think there's much more to it which would need to be discussed.
You are a big advocate of using multiple methods in one research project. Which combinations of method do you somehow recommend?
Any that makes sense.
Any that makes sense.
Right. What in particular I think we propose with colleagues is, or we claim there's an elected affinity anyway between case study research and QCA. Both in generating the data, you need to know your cases, and this helps you calibrating the sets. But also in post QCA studies. So which cases do we study for which purposes in order to make our QCA findings substantiate? Is this really a cause? I mean, that you cannot find out at the cross case level. You have to go to the within case level. So study typical cases and investigate the process, the causal process. So I find this a particularly useful and surprisingly underused combination, QCA follow-up case studies. But
process tracing.
Yeah, exactly, process tracing. But you might even, as we did in the one research, the outcome that is you want to explain is actually a difference in the effect of a certain factor, and this effect you have estimated with logistic regression, and you can use this as your outcome and calibrate this outcome. So this, if you will, is also some sort of using different methods for finding out the same, finding out something about a research question. What I don't necessarily find so interesting is do we get the same results using two different methods? So same data, I use regression and I use QCA, do I get something different? Yes. But I know in the beginning. So that was interesting and important to say at one point, but I think this has been exhausted.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for coming to Prague and for coming to the Institute of International Relations. And thank you very much for not just the interview, but the whole workshop on which you participated.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you.